Yeah. Well, Jim and Susan didn't stick around. The weather's nice. That's part of the problem. But also, I know since we're recording these, a lot of people are just watching from home too. Well, I want to go live. I'd rather see you in person. All right, there we go. All right. In the meantime, we're gonna get rolling, so we're not. Yeah, thanks, Greg. Appreciate it. What's that?
I'll check my Cowboy game over.
Who are the Cowboys playing today?
Give me a second. I know they were dead. I did not check it during the time.
That's okay if you did. All right. Ready to roll?
They are playing Panthers, and they're behind. The Panthers are in 14-13. So you must have missed Africa.
Yeah. Apparently, that's not the book I wanted. Doesn't matter.
I'm not playing a game left.
Everybody we root for yesterday lost. Except Alabama.
I haven't watched football in a long time. I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person. The problem, I read an interesting take on it. Where did it go? Which is that it was actually from another person from Michigan. Is that the Lions were so frustrating to watch that it just turned to South football. Period.
Yeah, I can see that.
You can only watch the Lions lose so many times before you just give up on that, the NFL.
Well, it's different with Texans. Texans will always be rooting for the Texas team.
Sure,
no matter
just
how bad
because
it
of Texan
is.
identity.
And the Cowboys have not made it easy over the years.
Yeah. The Lions are, the Lions are always in the highlight reel for the other team doing something amazing. Like, was it last week there was a 66-yard field goal to win the game against the Lions?
Well,
Okay.
the Cowboys always learn how to lose the game in the last 10 minutes.
Well, that's the Lions too, yeah.
Got the line on the white line.
Oh, there was a video that was about the Cowboys. It was supposed to be like a news report. But it's a shame that the Cowboys had this problem. They got scared. And they got scared of this white line that appeared on the field. And they just wouldn't cross it. And it was the goal line.
Yeah, that one could be told from the perspective of a lot of different things. Okay, so here's where we're at in the timeline. You know what I wanted this morning was my chalkboard, but I think the chalkboard fell apart finally. Yeah, it went the way of the dinosaurs, unfortunately. Well, it had already been broken, and then I think
And Andy couldn't fix it.
it had been fixed-ish. But the problem was one of the legs had splintered, and so we had kind of like glued it, duct taped it back together. But that was a very temporary fix. I need to get. You know what I need to
It's
get?
a man's way of fixing it.
Yeah, it is absolutely. What I need to do is I just need to get a whiteboard because I would rather chalkboard, whiteboard doesn't really matter to me. But I need to get a new one. So where we're at in the timeline is that we the past few weeks we're talking about kind of discovering the setting of what life looked like pre-European arrival. And so today what we're going to talk about the arrival of Europeans into the Pacific Northwest, what that means, how that affects things, and then what we'll probably do today is we'll not get into the nitty-gritty details, but we're going to kind of like do the overarching narrative of like Europeans arrive, how do we end up at the reservations, and then depending on how that goes, we might go into some more detail next week of like what's happening between 1750 and 1850. I want to correct my timeline a little bit. I kept saying, well, the Europeans arrived, in the 17th century. There are theories that there may or may not have been European explorers that arrived as early as like 1670, all the way up through the early 18th century. But the earliest, like, confirmed, documented date of arrival is actually, I think it's 1774 is when we get the first recorded expedition that makes landfall in somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We'll get back to that. But just keep in mind, if we're looking at the European, conquistador exploration timeline, Columbus theoretically arrives on the shores of America end of 15th century, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But exploration had been occurring long before Columbus arrived, right? So if that's 1500, you've got 200 years of significant Spanish, French, British, and even Russian exploration of the Atlantic and eventually the Pacific Oceans. So it's not out of reason that we didn't have somebody that made landfall in the Pacific Northwest. They may or may not have returned to Europe, in one piece. But when we're like confirming, when somebody is here, 1774. So one of the things to understand about the arrival of the Europeans in this region is that it has almost exclusively to do with who's in power at that given time. So the first Europeans to arrive here are the Spanish, okay? So in 1774, the Spanish had done, obviously controlled most of Central and South America, and the Spanish were the ones who had done the most exploration up the Pacific coast, hence California, right? We've got all the way, it's not a coincidence, we've got Los Angeles, San Diego, right? So the Spanish had come all the way up the Pacific coast. And they were the primary people, thank you, Murray.
It is hot.
I can see that, I can see the steam and everything. They were the primary people that had, what was I saying? That eventually changes. And the political climate during that time, or not political, but the international war climate, was that the Spanish and the French were allies, right? And the British were not. The British were at that time fighting the French and by extension the Spanish.
So the Spanish came all the way up to Oregon?
So the Spanish had significant colonies in Central and South America, and were doing expeditions up the western coast of the United States, right? So they actually settled, they made colonies in what is now Los Angeles and up the California coast. And then we're making further expeditions up because what they were interested in, of course, were the natural resources that were available. And here is the huge piece that fueled so much travel up here was the mythical Northwest Passage, right? Which I was listening to a great heavy metal version of the song. Have you guys heard the song Northwest Passage by the Canadian dude? Hold on. Stan Rogers. Anybody listen to Stan Rogers? Oh, you guys are missing out.
What, of course?
Stan Rogers is the Bob Dylan of Canada, sort of. But Stan Rogers has this amazing deep baritone. And almost all of his music, he did a lot of, what made him popular was that he popularized a lot of sea shanties before they became popular on TikTok and YouTube and stuff like a couple of years ago, apparently. Northwest Passage by Stan Rogers is a beautiful song, so I highly encourage you to check it out. So the Northwest Passage, of course, was this theoretical waterway that connected the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, right? And this fueled so much exploration. In fact, here's a bit of a tangent. Here's a bit of a non sequitur, but I found it interesting. Did you know that most of the settling in Quebec was fueled by trying to establish the Northwest Passage route? What was the specific name? So I grew up in technically the town of Lear, Michigan, But Leer was about 2 miles away from a larger municipality, which was, what was a municipality? It was a village. Lachine, Michigan. Lachine. Okay, Lachine in French means China. Like, it's literally Lachine, China. So, in my French class, I was wondering, how in the world did Lachine, Michigan get to be Lachine, Michigan? Well, Lachine, Michigan is named after Lachine, Quebec, and Lachine, Quebec was named as a joke because there was a guy, a captain, who had founded Lachine, Quebec because he was convinced that he had actually landed at the shore, or that he had found a passage that was going to lead him all the way to China, and so they named Lachine, Quebec because they were mocking him, like, oh look, it's China, when it really was just Canada. Right. So, anyways, he found. Sorry, that was a non sequitur, right? But I got to figure that. So, Northwest Passage. So you get Spanish and other explorers coming up the Pacific coast for two reasons. One was trying to find the resources that they were finding elsewhere. I mean, California turned out to be a good one, right? Gold Rush, all that stuff. But when they get to the Pacific Northwest, the resources that they end up getting first are mainly fur. The fur trade was very thriving up here. But then eventually, of course, salmon and dried salmon. They didn't have freezers to pack it in and take it back in sushi quality. They did have salt. So, preserved fish. But what then happens is that they begin establishing outposts, mainly at the beginning at the mouth of the Columbia. So Astoria is named after a guy named Astor, who was British, but was working with the Hudson, or no, he was American, but he was working with the Hudson Bay Trading Company, which I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll talk about that in a bit as well too. Sorry, I need to back up. I'm jumping way too far ahead. And if you're curious, and I'll send you the I keep promising to send you links, and I don't think I'm doing that. I need to write it down with another pencil. So the resource that I'm using here is actually a study by the University of Washington. So it's on University of Washington's website. They've got a great kind of synopsis of the history of the arrival of Europeans in the Pacific Northwest, as well as these books. But the book, out of all the books, all the 5 different books that I read, nobody really did an in-depth description of Nobody really did an in-depth description of what colonial settlement looked like up here. They mainly talked about the consequences of it and the conflict. What I was curious about was, like, how did people arrive up here? Send links. Okay, thank you. Whew. Where was I? Okay. So, I already talked about the Spanish coming up here. Anyways, yeah, I'm right. So Balboa potentially came up as far as Oregon in his, which total non sequitur again. I had to do a report on Francisco Balboa in 6th grade, and I dressed up as him. Anyhow, so, yes. So, here's the other thing. I mentioned the Russians, right? So, interestingly enough, the Russians during this time were doing a lot of exploration of the Pacific, but they were mainly trying to reach the shores of North America from, across the Pacific Ocean crossing. So, in 1725, there was actually an expedition that set out from St. Petersburg. That was actually the original discovery of the Bering Straits. So they arrived on Alaska in 1725, but did not end up making it far enough down the coast to arrive at, like, Canada or eventually the whatchamajig. So 1774, the Spanish launched what they refer to as the Perez Expedition. And they actually start out from a place called San Bias in Mexico, and which is over on, obviously, it's on the Pacific Ocean, western coast of Mexico. And their original purpose was actually to try and spy on Russian traders who they suspected were coming down to, again, they didn't really have a full understanding of the scale of distance that they were talking about. Because, like, this is the thing, right? This is also what fueled the exploration for the Northwest Passage, is they didn't really comprehend exactly how far it was from example, like Russia to Oregon, right? We obviously knew where China was, we knew where Japan was, we had trading that was going on there, but in terms of like charting the Pacific Ocean, we did not have any understanding of what the coast looked like from like Alaska down to California. So in their minds, in the minds of the Spanish, they were worried that the Russians at that point had started to encroach down towards Mexico, and so they sent this Perez expedition out to find the Russians, to discover where the Russians were going. And so they were instructed by Spain, by the king, I guess, to go as far as 60 degrees north latitude, which is ridiculously far. I mean, we're on the 45th parallel here. I mean, what would 60 degrees north latitude take you to? Would that be up northern end of British Columbia at least?
Yep, I know.
Would it? Okay, yeah. And so again, this just evidences they didn't really understand what they were getting themselves into at this point, right? So the Perez expedition obviously does not make it up to 60 degrees north latitude. They essentially make it all the way up to the coast of British Columbia, the Queen Charlotte Islands. You guys know the Queen Charlotte Islands? Yep. Glenn, I figured you would. And they run into the Haida people, Haida, who are a powerhouse in terms of the native peoples of British Columbia. So if you go to the Royal Museum on the island of Victoria off the coast of British Columbia, they have a museum there which has a whole exhibit dedicated to the first. Canada refers to the First Peoples. That's the language, the terminology they use. They have a whole exhibit of the First Peoples, and you can find all about the Haida, who were. So if you have, are you familiar with kind of the artwork that's generally attributed to the native peoples of British Columbia in the area? So it's like it's kind of like the stylized drawings of sea life, obviously whales, seals, stuff like that. I'll pull some up and show it to you in a little bit.
Mainly in totem poles?
What's that?
Mainly in totem poles?
And they created totem poles as well
That
too.
museum has the largest concentration of totem poles of anywhere.
Yes, it does. Yes.
Just
Yeah.
phenomenal.
It's an amazing museum. I highly encourage to go there. The other cool thing that I mentioned this maybe last week was that they also have a thing where you can go around and you can hear all of the different original languages. So like they'll have like, what's the word for this, right? And then they'll have like 6 different languages that were spoken all saying that same word. It's super fascinating. So they encountered the Haida, who I already mentioned kind of a powerhouse. And in fact, many historians suspect that the Haida encroached as far down as the Puget Sound area, to the extent that many of the tribes in the Puget Sound area had heard of the Haida and kind of saw them as the boogeyman, because the Haida were going to come take over their land and stuff like that, because they controlled so much territory up there, and they were as well coastal people, so they didn't encroach too far inland, but really ran up and down the coast of what's modern British Columbia. Okay, so Perez goes up there, encounters the Haida, establishes trade with the Haida actually, and mainly what happens is it's an exchange of like blankets and blankets, cedar tree items, skins, sea otter pelts, hats, all these stuff in exchange for metal, right? Because metal would have been something very hard to come by in a we're not industrialized yet, but a pre-smelting society. So there wasn't a lot of metal present along the Pacific Northwest. It's mostly stone tools or wood tools and that kind of stuff. So the Spanish established a pretty lucrative trade, trading metals for all these, cheap metals for all these goods. Sea otter skins especially were in high demand for coats and whatnot. So Perez marks the beginning of Spanish exploration up there, but Perez doesn't actually establish anything yet on the coast of like Oregon, Washington. He goes all the way to British Columbia, kind of passes over. They do some stop-offs along the way, but then what happens is some things shift. So, have you heard of what's the name of this treaty? The Treaty of Tordesillas. Have you heard of this before? So, so I already mentioned the kind of international conflict that was happening during this time. where the Spanish were afraid of the Russians. But what you've got going on at the same time period is the English are starting to move into this area as well too. I don't want to talk about this. Well, I'll come back to that. So 1774, Spanish arrive, but then over the next 50 years or so, what happens is that the British begin to establish control and end up essentially kicking the Spanish out of the Pacific Northwest. And we could get into the political history of that, which would be fascinating, but it's not necessarily relevant to what's going on here. So if you fast forward a little bit, then finally the picture of what you get is you get semi-private, semi-governmental trading interests who are representing the Pacific Northwest. The primary numero uno power broker that eventually takes control of most of this area is the Hudson Bay Trading Company. So there have been many different things that have been talked about, like, for example, the East India Trading Company and all of these different powerhouses in the British mercantile world. Hudson Bay Trading Company were the power brokers for Canada, much of northern, modern United States, and eventually the Pacific Northwest. And so they end up establishing forts and trading sites up and down the Pacific coast. And I already mentioned, it's a guy named Astor, who's actually American, that's working for the Hudson Bay Trading Company, that founds lands at what is now modern day Astoria, right? And so they establish a fort and a trading spot at the mouth of the Columbia. And at that point, it was for the same stuff. They were establishing relationships with the tribes that existed that they ran into, mainly in the interest of getting furs and other tradable items, and then taking them back eventually. And keep in mind, the Spanish could go down south to Mexico and ferry goods across Mexico through even the Isthmus of Panama if they wanted the short trip overland, and then eventually back to Spain. Whereas the British were needing to take things basically across the United States or Canada, the long way around. However, therefore, that was the big impetus then for the discovery of the passage. Now, the reason this is important is because with this need to discover a waterway that connects the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, that encourages people to go further and further down the Columbia, which leads colonizers eventually, but then traders at this time, further and further inland, right? And further inland as they go, they discover more native peoples. Now this is where things start to get tragic, right? Is that, as we're witnessing right now, when you introduce a disease into a controlled climate, where there is no pre-existing form of that disease, you're essentially setting fire to a gasoline-soaked pile of twigs. This is what happens for the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. It maybe wasn't the first visit, it maybe wasn't the second or even the 15th, but eventually what happens is that smallpox and potentially tuberculosis and some other diseases get introduced into the Pacific Northwest, into the tribes that are there. And of course, as you've got journeys that are going further and further inland, you get this disease being spread further and further. And then as we talked about last week, these tribes were not living in total isolation. These households were not living in total isolation. They were trading with each other as well too. And so as happened in 2019 and 2020, as we watched the coronavirus virus spread across the globe because of travel and trade and all the different things, the same thing happens in the Pacific Northwest. So if we go back to medieval Europe, what do you know the percentage of the population that died because of the Black Death? Is that a data point that got stuck in your brains? Any guesses?
Very.
Yeah, most estimates point at about 33, a third. Some say as high as 40% of the population of Western Europe died as a result of plague, the Black Death, which is a disease now that's easily curable with a round of antibiotics, right? Totally mind-blowing when you think about it. Over 85% of the population of the Pacific Northwest died as a result of smallpox and other diseases. So over 85%. Yeah. So this is just such a ballpark figure. This is such a rough estimation. The estimation is that between Washington, Oregon, there were about 500,000 people that were living here pre-European experience. After, when the reservations are established in 1850, you have tribes of 15 and 20 people that are signing these reservation treaties. So over 85% of the population does. So this is a tough thing for many reasons. It's awful, and it's certainly. It's not even something that you can really put in perspective, right? Because when we look at the coronavirus pandemic, it's absolutely tragic. The United States just passed 700,000 deaths, which is a flat number, is a gigantic number. But as a percentage of the population, right, we're not even close to double digits. We're barely, not even a percentile of the population of the U.S. has died. Imagine 85% of the population disappearing, right? So we're not even talking about every family being affected by it. We're talking about entire families being wiped off the face of the map, right? To the extent where the villages that many explorers are encountering. Now, because imagine this. These explorers are still continuing to go further and further inland. But imagine, the explorers that are arriving, say, in 1830, I'm just picking out random locations, random numbers, that have gone up past where the Tri-Cities are now, past the Dalles, up towards Pendleton. Imagine encountering a tribe out there, that they arrive and they essentially see a ghost village, right? Where there are these houses that have fallen into disrepair, and there are maybe 10, 15 people who are not super healthy at this point, who are living there on their own. So you can imagine the mindset that this would put people in, which is that it's essentially an abandoned land. It's an empty land, right? So when we talk about colonialization, when we talk about white people taking over land, it's bad, right? We've established that there are no good effects that come with it. However, I just want to put you in the mindset of these folks, is that they essentially saw Washington, Oregon as being empty, right? Devoid of people. Did they put two and two together, that it was the diseases that they brought that killed these people? I don't know. It's a really interesting question. Or did they think that it was just a civilization in decline? Because this was a narrative that influenced even the Spanish conquistadors, right? They didn't understand that a lot of the native peoples of the Americas in general were migratory. They weren't always staying at the same village. They were going from place to place depending on where the herds were, depending on seasonal availability of water and other resources. And so, there were many ideas that there were the abandoned lost city of El Dorado filled with gold, right? So imagine arriving in the Pacific Northwest, and seeing that, you've got essentially empty villages. So in their minds, they were thinking, okay, right, this is an empty land that is full of wealth, of natural resources, whether it's, beavers or sea otters or fish, or even, and imagine coming and seeing these towering, red cedars and Douglas fir and all of these amazingly huge trees that are present in the Pacific Northwest, and seeing the dollar signs light up, lumber. Norway had been essentially deforested at this point, right? So we're not talking about Norway per se. But you can see that this would be an enticing thing. And seeing that most of these villages are empty or minimally occupied. So in their minds, yeah, this is our land to claim, right? There is no city here. There is no nation that controls this. These are just loosely affiliated small groups of people that have no guiding governments, that don't have metal, that probably in their minds seem barbaric, right? Now, obviously, in modern recent history, we have begun to undo much of that thinking, right? we have begun to realize that, by and large, the native peoples that lived in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere had essentially attained a state of equilibrium with the environment that they lived in. There was never going to be a whole lot more than 500,000 people living in the Pacific Northwest, because they weren't living in an urbanized environment where you pack a bunch of people into an area and support them based on an industrialized agriculture system that provides food to that area, right? We talked about it some last week, and it'd be an interesting conversation at some point, but in reality, you just have to understand the stark difference between a society that's a hunter-gatherer, migratory society versus what Western Europe had become at that point, which is a society of cities. And this is right at kind of the waning or waxing edge of moving into a capitalist industrial economy at this point, right? We're witnessing kind of the twilight of the monarchical era to a certain extent. And I say this just, again, this isn't about demonizing any one group. I mean, don't get me wrong. When we get into some of the details, we'll find plenty of reasons to demonize the people that were involved in it. But at this point, I just want you guys to be able to understand kind of the motivations that were going on here. And it wasn't all just greed and, oppressing, killing the native peoples. This is the way their minds were working. And this is important because I mentioned the Hudson Bay Trading Company. One of the pictures that we get of what relations looked like between native peoples and, for example, the British, was that things were actually not that awful, right? Because at this point in the game, these folks aren't necessarily interested in occupying this land. They're interested, not that this is a good thing, but they're interested in extracting wealth from it. They're interested in the fur trade. They're interested in salmon and other things. They're interested in timber and lumber and all these things. They're not interested in necessarily conquering a whole new landscape. So for the Hudson Bay Trading Company, they actually, in some respects, had relatively decent practices for that time and age. and read the asterisk that I'm putting in there, which is to say that they maintained good relationships with the native peoples that they encountered, because good relationships meant good trade, right? They didn't want to be fighting battles. They didn't want to be having to deal with hostile people. They wanted good relationships because that meant that they could trade, metals, whatever, for all these resources that they had out there. So what this meant was that a lot of the time the groups of traders that were living in these forts or living in these trading sites were not primarily white Europeans. They would bring in native peoples from Canada and from even as far as Michigan to come and live and work here, hoping that that would engender trust between them and the tribes that were there. And they would even employ members of the household groups, the tribes that were here, in order to facilitate better arrangements, right? So again, when it's the sacred dollar, or the pound in this case, that's at stake, they were primarily interested in prioritizing trade, not in conquest. Where this begins to shift is not to demonize ourselves, but it begins to shift with the arrival of Americans. And again, in order to understand what's going on here, you have to understand the political climate, not the political, the international war climate that's going on. So Perez's expedition arrives in 1774. We know what 1776 is about, right? We don't need to get into that one. What happens in 1812? Right? It's round two with the Brits, for lack of a better way of putting it. And who sides with who? War of 1812. You remember what happens? Native Americans side with the British. How do you think that disposed the American peoples towards, the American colonialists towards the native peoples? Not great. not great at all. And an important thing happens, is that post-war of 1812, the Brits get kicked out of what now becomes the Oregon and the Washington territories. So the British Hudson Bay Trading Company is forced to move its borders up to what is now the modern day boundary between Canada and the United States. I mentioned this already, but if you've ever wondered why British Columbia is called British Columbia, it's because originally British Columbia extended all the way down to the Columbia River. Right? So no longer does it, obviously, so now we've got British Columbia. So the Hudson Bay Trading Company is forced to withdraw its interests up to that new line. So then what happens is then American trading interests begin to move into this region. American interests who just won a war against, in many minds, this alliance between the native peoples, hostile native peoples, and the British. Also, for you, those of you, including myself, who are fans of Westerns and that whole genre of stuff, there's also this mindset that exists in the United States as we expand west into the wild west, the wild unknown. There's this mindset that one of the major conflicts that we have is with the wild Indians, the hostile natives of the plains and elsewhere, right? And there are, go back and look at a timeline of all these things that are occurring. Trail of Tears, Custer's Last Stand, over this time period while the Americans are settling into the Pacific Northwest, imagine that their psyches are being colored by the stories that they're hearing from the frontier experience. Also, there is conflict that's happening. It's not nearly on the same scale as what you get going on, for example, with the Cherokee and the Crow and these folks. But there is conflict that's going on. And a lot of it is arising out of the way that the Americans are handling relations between themselves and the native peoples. The British are interested in good friends makes good trade. The Americans are interested in exploiting whatever resources happen to be there. So there are numerous examples of how the Americans who eventually kind of inherited the trade in that region would intentionally try to cheat tribes out of resources. They would intentionally want to exchange whiskey and other stuff instead of promised metals or whatever they had established. And of course, what was going on was, and it's really kind of an interesting social thing to think about, is that many of these tribal leaders were realizing this stuff is bad, bad for us. They'd never encountered alcohol before. This stuff is bad for us. We don't want it. It's ruining our children, whatever. But then there's numerous other examples, which we'll get into the details of next week. But to make a long story short, the other thing that's important is understanding that the Americans were not just interested in trade. They were interested in settling the Pacific Northwest, right? Because these were the Oregon and the Washington territories. Just like we have the gradual expanse of settlers moving westward in the United States, we now have this region up in the Pacific Northwest. And this is what fuels, to a certain extent, our beloved Lewis and Clark as well, too. There's not to miscast or demonize them, but they're a product of the American political climate, American society at the time too. They're interested in establishing a route that extends from settled America out to this region that we had not just inherited, but relatively recently inherited, for means of getting people out there. Right? It wasn't just exploration. It was establishing a reliable path that leads to Oregon. We get the establishment of what we refer to as the Oregon Trail. Fueled one of the most cliched video games and all of everything. Right? You get dysentery and you die. Right? But the Oregon Trail was essentially a settler superhighway. Very far from it, according to modern standards, but it was a way for American settlers to make their way out there. So you can imagine that this might have an effect on the native peoples. Because when they were dealing with the Hudson Bay Trading Company, they were dealing with people that wanted to trade, right? So they were okay with a fort being established up in this part that isn't really fishable, like you dumb whiteys, go ahead. Don't you know that that's like the worst place to fish or whatever? There aren't no fish up the mountain. I'm being facetious. But then suddenly the Americans are establishing settlements and farmsteads and homesteads and all of this stuff, and begin essentially gifting land to people. Now, I mentioned this maybe 2 weeks ago, but do you know what the size of the plot was that was given to settlers? It's a square mile. They were getting a square mile of land. That's what was being guaranteed to them. Can anybody, especially a mid-19th century farmer, farm a square mile of land? Heck no. No, there's no way that you can. That is a huge plot of land, right? You need one of those modern John Deere's with GPS just to even think about it, right? But that's how much land was being divided up. So imagine this setting, right, where you've got a family that comes in, and again, maybe the family doesn't have any ill intent. They see opportunity. They see this a chance to have land of their own, to create their own destiny. These things are part of the American dream, right? And they get given this parcel of land in the wilds of the Oregon Territory. They set up a farm, and then suddenly you've got people knocking on the door saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" Right? But chances are you don't speak each other's language. All that the native peoples know is that all of a sudden there's some dude with a gun that's claiming this area, right? He didn't get the okay from us. This is maybe where we harvested Wapato. Maybe this is the area where the deer run goes through. Why do they get to claim that land? And we don't share a common language. And so what do you think happens, right? Is that you do get conflict. You do get violence. And so there are stories of settler families that are attacked or killed by native peoples. And then what happens is you bring in more people with guns, right, to defend your claim, defend your state, and you get settlers in the Oregon Territory are writing back to their senator or writing back to government officials saying, you need to send people out here to defend our claim to this land. And this is what happens, right? And this is how you get, and then combine that with the fact that disease has been ravaging these people, right? And so they're really a shadow of their former selves. The writing was on the wall long before we reached the establishment of reservations, which is that there was just no feasible way that these native people were going to be able to maintain control of their land in the face of the tide of settlers. Okay, it's 12:05. We'll begin to wrap up here. So let's finally arrive at the establishment of the reservations. So when the reservations finally get established, you've got kind of, again, two things going on in the minds of the people. By the people, I mean the American government. That was the page I wanted to hold open. One is that you've had this conflict, you've had this stuff going on, and again, to be honest about human motivation here, they wanted to deal with the Indian problem. Okay, so the idea of behind the reservations, and I'm speaking mainly about the Pacific Northwest here. I assume that this kind of holds true for what happens in the plains, the Midwest, and stuff like that. But this is my reading is specifically with regards to this. So they want to deal with the Indian problem, which is if we can put them all in one spot where we know where they are, and set them up, I'm using quotes here, with resources, perhaps we can integrate these people or convert them into our mode of living, right? And this was part of the motivation. When they established on the reservations, we'll teach them to farm, we'll teach them to build homes and to live in homes that we'll teach them to own land, right? To fit into our model of it, okay? And so, again, I'm really trying hard not to present this in a biased light, right? I'm just throwing the facts out there. These are the things that were motivated. The other piece of it is that there, believe it or not, in the 1850s, there are people who actually do care about what's happening to the native peoples. In looking back at history, their heart may have been in the right place, but certainly wasn't the right way to go about it. But they are looking upon these declining tribes, these declining households, looking at these, ghost towns of villages, looking at the conflict that's occurring between the native peoples and the American peoples, and in their hearts, at least in some regards, they justify the establishment of the reservations as this is ultimately what's in the best interest of these people. This is the way that we maintain their life going forward. Because in a lot of ways, this is mid-industrial expansion. This is inevitable in the minds of folks during this time period. So it's going to happen no matter what. Let's maintain, and again, I'm being snarky here. Let's maintain a reserve where these people can live on, so that we didn't totally get rid of them. Being snarky. That's what fuels the establishment of the reservations. Now, as with a lot of things, you can what's the idiom that I'm looking for? It's not titled by stripes. You can tell the merit of things based on how they were achieved. And in reality, the way they were achieved was not great. Because essentially what happens is that after each of these tribes signs their X on this sheet of paper that they didn't understand, was not communicated to them, and even if it was communicated to them, wasn't often held up. The promises weren't held up in the long run. What essentially happened, as I already mentioned last week, was that militia was sent in, rounded up these folks, forcefully marched them to these new locations that they were forced to settle on, that really had nothing to do with where they were living before, the resources that they survived upon, or their cultural identity, their cultural heritage. It was a spot of land that they were placed upon so that they could be, have a place to live, with the express intent of eventually being assimilated into the way that things work, right? Our society. And what you witness then is from the founding of the reservation in the 1850s all the way up through when we talk about the Termination Act, what you witness is repeated attempts with the Termination Act kind of being the final thrust in this direction of trying to turn Indians into white people, right? And this includes boarding schools. This includes the intentional eradication of native languages. This includes freezing out native peoples from their cultural sites. We've got a great modern example now of the Grand Ron tribe now just regaining the Willamette Falls area, which was a sacred spot for them, right? Which you don't have to stretch your brain too far to understand. I mean, for a people who salmon and fish and water is so much a part of their personality, how can you not look upon Willamette Falls and understand this obviously meant a lot to these people? You can understand why they want to reclaim it. So there. So what we'll talk about next week then is what goes wrong during this time period. What causes a lot of the awfulness to occur? What are the abuses that are heaped upon the native peoples post-establishment of the reservations and some of that stuff? Sound good? And as with all this stuff, I should give this disclaimer at the beginning. I am not an expert in these things. I've just read a bunch of books. At some point, I do want to bring in a speaker from hopefully the Grand Ron Educational Trust to give a native perspective. But which is my way of saying that don't just take my word for it. Feel free to read and do other things. But
there was an article in the Clackamas Review this week about the Grand Ron.
oh, was there really?
Mm-hmm.
I have to